As Ray Harryhausen films go, The First Men in the Moon is a bit of an outlier, for more reasons than one. Could a comic book adaptation convey its uniqueness? I sincerely hope not. Since Ray had started making films in colour, they all had one thing in common: a solid historic setting. Whether it be ancient Greece, the Middle East of Sinbad, or even the American Civil War, they all featured tales set in the past and were, one way or another, fantasy. Not since 1957's 20 Million Miles to Earth had he dabbled in science fiction, but his next project in 1964 was going to see him work on a sci-fi story from one of the true masters of the genre. H.G. Wells was born in 1866 in my hometown of Bromley in England. By the time of his death, he was viewed by many as the father of science fiction, and it's easy to see why. He burst onto the literary scene in 1895 with The Time Machine. 1896 saw him release The Island of Dr. Moreau. The Invisible Man followed the year after. The War of the Worlds the year after that. And there were many more books and short stories between and after, right up to 1941, 5 years before his death at the age of 79. Among those many writings was The First Men in the Moon. Originally published in serialised form in the Strand magazine in late 1900, it was released in book form the following year, 1901. In 1919, it was adapted into one of the first ever science fiction films. Some people say that it was the first ever. However, H.G. Wells' fellow science fiction colossus, Jules Verne, had one of his books, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, adapted a few years previously. That 1919 version of the film is now sadly considered lost. But in 1964, another version was released, and this one had behind it the talents of cinema's greatest stop-motion animator. As usual, Ray's great supporter, Charles H. Schneer, was the producer, and the director was someone else that he had worked with before, Nathan Duran, the man who had directed both 20 Million Miles to Earth from Ray's black and white era and The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. The film was released in the summer of 1964, and it took several months for a comic book adaptation to be released. Don't get me wrong, the original book had been adapted into comic book form before, and since. Classics Illustrated released a version in 1958, illustrated by the often awesome Al Williamson. He isn't the artist on our version. Marvel released their own version later, in 1978. But the one we are concerned with is the adaptation of the film, released in 1965 by Gold Key Comics. Gold Key? Who are Gold Key? If you've watched other episodes in this series, you'll know all about Dell Comics. They published adaptations of all of Ray's films from The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad to Jason and the Argonauts. That last one came out in 1963, a year after a seismic event had happened to Dell. Back in 1938, Dell had partnered with Western Publishing in a deal that would see comic content created by Western but financed and distributed by Dell. They paid the money, so they got their logo on them. But in 1962, it occurred to Western that actually they could fund and distribute their material themselves. So they did, taking with them a stack of licensed rights to a variety of characters, shows and films. This left Dell a poorer publisher, and although they continued for some years after, they were in a steady decline. Meanwhile, Western's own comic book imprint, Gold Key Comics, was born, and continued publishing popular titles that were previously released under the Dell logo, such as Tarzan, along with some new ones, such as The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Star Trek, and this. You'd never guess it was from the 60s, would you? Groovy. So, after releasing 4 Harryhausen adaptations in a row, Dell would go on to release just one more. More on that in a future episode. As for this one, our old friend and Dell's stalwart Paul S. Newman is back again. He wrote the scripts for The Three Worlds of Gulliver and Jason and the Argonauts, and returns to complete his hat-trick. We have a different artist this time around, as Harold Fred Fredericks takes charge of the pencil and ink pen. He worked on countless strips over several decades, mainly as an inker, with his finest moment, surely, Captain America meets the Asthma Monster. Only joking. He was actually the artist on the Mandrake the Magician comic strip from 1964 until it ended in 2013, when he retired. Not only that, but he wrote it for its last 14 years. I suppose you want to have a look at this comic now, don't you? Go on then. The Gold Key Comics format was very much the same as Dell's. In other words, generally speaking, their comics carried very little to no adverts. Indeed, there's only one in this comic, and I'm not even sure if you can count that. They didn't carry any credits for the creators. And yes, that one advert in this issue is on the inside cover, and much like previous Ray Harryhausen adaptations we've seen from Dell, it revolves around the actual film. Although it seems to be a little bit confused around the story of the film, as it suggests that the Victorian explorers that are the main characters of the story aren't the first men on the moon, and that just wasn't the point of the film. Oh well, the adaptation itself seems to get it, and it starts the same way as the film, with a modern day, that is 1964, moon landing. We get a few pages detailing the module's descent onto the lunar surface. We see the international crew with American, Russian and British astronauts, and we see a rather low-tech way of lowering the astronauts to the moon's surface as they are winched down from the module. Mind you, saying that, the real thing was hardly high-tech. It was a ladder. You don't get more low-tech than that. But thanks to the winch, contact is made, and there you have it, the first steps of mankind on Earth's satellite. Cue global celebrations, particularly in the home countries of the astronauts concerned. It was a pretty nice touch having the Russians involved. After all, this was the 1960s, the height of the Cold War. Whilst celebrations continue on Earth, something is afoot on the moon. The three-man team have discovered something. It's a small Union Jack flag. The British astronaut says it's nothing to do with him. In fact, he thinks it's downright balmy. They spell that word wrong back in the adaptation of The Three Worlds of Gulliver as well. Balmy is not spelt with an L, not in this context. That's like a hot and humid night. Balmy should be spelt with an R, balmy, as in England's balmy army. That wasn't a military reference, by the way, it was sport. Cricket, in fact. Yes, cricket. Come on, you know I'm English. But back to the story, because the astronauts have found something else. It's an envelope containing a legal summons in the name of Catherine Callender of Cherry Cottage, Dymchurch, and it was written in 1899. So how did those items get there? I guess these three astronauts aren't the first men on the moon after all. In an effort to get some answers, the UN Space Agency send some of their men to Dymchurch, which is actually in H.G.Wells' home county of Kent. They are actually hoping to prove that Catherine Callender never existed, and that this whole thing is some kind of elaborate hoax. At the Dymchurch Registry Office, it seems they may be in luck, because there is no record of anybody by that name of being born in the town. But when one of the representatives mentions that the address was Cherry Cottage, that jogs the registrar's memory, because he remembers a marriage that involved a Catherine Callender. So she wasn't born there, but she certainly did live there, in the past tense, because she died 10 years ago. However, her widower, Arnold Bedford, is still alive and living at the Limes nursing home. When the UN's team visit Mr. Bedford and show him photos of the objects that have been found on the moon, he is both shocked and concerned. He says the astronauts must be warned. There is danger up on the moon. Great danger. He tells the agents that he has been to the moon back in 1899. Back home, nobody believed him, and that was one of the reasons why he was put in this home. Naturally, the agents want to know all of the details, and he, Mr. Bedford, is happy to share them with them. He tells them that when he was younger, he rented a cottage out near Dymchurch. It was called Cherry Cottage, and he was all of that then. Huh? What's that supposed to mean? I was all that then. He's all that. I don't think that phrase was doing the rounds back in the Victorian era. He was trying to strike it rich by writing a play. Not that he was having much success. And he had just received a demand for outstanding rent. Something that he kept from his beloved, the one and only Catherine Callender. This is the first time she has seen the cottage, and she loves it. Although there is a neighbour who isn't quite so convinced about the new lodgers. This neighbour is Joseph Cavor, played in the film by Lionel Jeffries. And, in all fairness, you could probably recognise him from this comic. That's a good likeness. He is a research scientist, and in an effort to maintain the privacy around his latest experiments, he offers to buy the cottage. Catherine, believing that the cottage is actually owned by Arnold and knowing that he's short of money, agrees to sell it. Not sure it's her place to do so. As soon as Bedford learns this, he hotfoots it round to Cavor's place to try to explain to him that he can't sell the cottage. But whilst he's trying to explain this, he sees that Cavor is in the midst of some kind of experiment. He is creating what he has called Cavorite. Any of us can use screens to cut off heat or light. Cavorite will cut off gravity. Bedford says, "Gravity? The pull of the earth that holds us on the ground?" Yeah, thanks for that. The Cavorite is applied to an object in liquid form, and once it dries, its effects are felt. That's the theory anyway. And to prove it, Cavor applies it to the chair that Bedford is sitting in. And indeed, after a short wait, its effects are undeniable. Now, by this point, the film had shown its unique character amongst Harryhausen flicks. Unlike the rest of his films, this one was a lot more comedic, farcical even. Something that, thankfully, isn't apparent on the page. Although I do miss the geese that played a surprisingly significant role in the film. With the properties of the Cavorite proved, Bedford sees a financial opportunity. He says to Mr. Cavor that actually he can buy his cottage for $10,000, which is an odd thing for one Englishman to say to another in England, especially as it's not even his cottage to sell, on one condition, that Mr. Cavor lets him invest in his project, with money that he doesn't have. Cavor says, "Excellent, I could use the additional funds." Yeah, well, good luck with that. But then he drops the bombshell that the next stage in his project is to head to the moon. Of course, Bedford has major doubts about this whole moon business, but with the motivation of possible financial reward, he goes along with it. He also gets Kate to handle the sale of the cottage by signing it over to her. Surely that's some kind of massive property fraud. Meanwhile, Cavor has built their mode of transport to the moon. It's a sphere made from roller blinds and railway buffers. How very steampunk. Then the fateful day comes, when we find our two intrepid explorers sitting inside the sphere, waiting for the freshly applied Cavorite to dry. Their launch is imminent. Unfortunately, Kate has just found out that she has been made an accomplice to a major crime, and understandably is quite insistent that she speaks to Bedford about it. But the takeoff procedure cannot be slowed or stopped, so quickly she is hauled inside the sphere just in time before it flies skyward, through the glass roof of Cavor's giant greenhouse and up into the night sky. I suppose it's understandable that the whole business of the cottage fraud is forgotten about now that they are flying through space. And it actually turns out to be quite a relaxing journey. Then, after a few days, they approach the moon. Now at this point, the way that they control the direction of the capsule is actually quite clever, although there's no way on earth it would actually work in reality. Because to adjust the direction of the capsule's approach, Cavor opens one of the Cavorite blinds, allowing a little bit of the gravity of the Earth or the Sun to move them from one side or to another. Even when the Earth is directly behind them, using some of its gravity to slow down their descent. Nonetheless, it's still a bit of a rough landing, but very soon they have a new problem to ponder. They're going to have to open the entrance hatch to the sphere to explore the moon, but of course there's no oxygen there. The two men both have diving suits to keep them alive, but there isn't a third one for Kate. So how are they going to keep her safe? Simple. There's an airtight floor hatch and she can just stay in the crawl space until it's safe to come out. How degrading. So now the time has come to explore the lunar surface. And they certainly do make it look fun. Of course, they are sure not to forget their duty as typical Victorian imperialists claiming the moon in the name of their queen. Give it 30 years, they'll have a steam railway system in place, I'm sure. If this wasn't already amazing enough for them, when they go to explore a crater, they discover something astounding. Because the floor of the crater is covered with glittering coloured glass, prisms as they call them. But when Bedford goes to investigate, he gets too close and falls through. He survives the fall, but when Bedford lowers a rope to help get him out, Cavor tugs on it, pulling his colleague in with him. And as Bedford falls, his helmet falls from his head. Now this could be a disaster, but it actually leads to a discovery. The discovery of fresh air. Not on the surface of the moon, but in the chamber in which they've both fallen into. It also leads to another discovery. As the two of them lower themselves further into the chamber to search for the helmet, because after all, they're going to need that to get back to the sphere, they discover that it has already been found by the inhabitants of the moon. Now I'm tempted to say, hooray, finally some Ray Harryhausen creatures on the page. However, the truth is that the majority of the moon's inhabitants in the film were actually played by children wearing monster suits. This film, along with, I suppose, The 3 Worlds of Gulliver, are both very light on Ray's stop-motion creatures. So these creatures that Cavor refers to as Selenites want the helmet, Bedford wants his helmet, and as he says, it looks like they've got a fight on their hands. Yes! But Cavor says, no, we mustn't teach them false. But luckily for us, Bedford ignores him and socks it to the leading Selenite. Nice one, Bedford. Ignore him, give us what we want. He buys the pair some time, and now the race is on to get back to the surface, to stay ahead of the pursuing Selenites. There's that word again. How could they possibly know what they're called? I get it. They don't know what they're called. They're just calling them Selenites because the moon is often referred to as Selene. A bit like Earthlings, I suppose. Makes sense. They make it onto the moon's surface to discover that the sphere is gone, dragged away into the underground cave system of the Selenites. They have no choice but to re-enter the subterranean realm, to find the sphere and rescue Kate. But the first thing they find after jettisoning their diving suits is neither of those two things, but instead, yay, a Ray Harryhausen monster. Due to the fact that this creature is feeding on fungus, Cavor suggests that it is a harmless vegetarian. Well, if that is true, it has a friend who has a hankering for man flesh. A brief chase ends with our heroes being split up, as Cavor doesn't realise that Bedford has found a perfectly safe hiding place behind a cluster of crystals. Cavor runs straight into the arms of some Selenites, and they then use their technology to finally drive away the moon beast. Now this may seem like a particularly bad position for our heroes, but all is not quite as bad as it seems. For a start, they seem to have no interest at all in Bedford and just leave him there. Cavor they do take away, and indeed they throw him in a cell. However, he isn't alone, because he is put in a cell with Kate, and it's whilst they are there that the Selenites begin to communicate with them. Being a man of science, Cavor thinks this is fantastic, absolutely imperial in fact. And his excitement grows even more when they are taken to meet the supreme Selenite. Cavor is overjoyed, Kate isn't quite so sure, but Bedford, who has now found the pair of them, is certain. He needs to get himself and them off of the moon and back to Earth. After fetching a gun that they had brought with them on the sphere, he returns to see an incredible sight. And he is now so familiar with the moon's inhabitants that they have entered his everyday lexicon, as he says, "Great galloping Selenites," because there before him is some vast underground chamber, and at the top of a flight of stairs, which Cavor is at that moment ascending, is the supreme Selenite. There's a brief dialogue between Cavor and this being as he explains what life on Earth is like. But there's one thing in particular that the Selenites are interested in. The supreme Selenite says that their concern is with the men of violence, because others from Earth will be coming to the moon soon, and he is concerned that they will leave their galleries strewn with dead. Cavor then naively slips up, as he says there need be no others, because only he holds the secret of Cavorite. Bedford is instantly aware that this is an error. He tries to warn Cavor to get out of there to save his life. But Cavor insists no, they must stay there. They must learn about the Selenites, to understand them. He tells Bedford that they don't understand force, but Bedford does, and pulling the rifle free, he lines up the Supreme Selenite in his sights. But the Supreme Selenite was protected by some kind of protective shield, and that shield is now short-circuited by Bedford's shot. And now it really is time for action. Our three heroes race for the sphere, with Selenites close behind them. In fact, they aren't just behind them, they're also ahead of them, already on the sphere. But Bedford sets to them with his rifle. As he and Kate dive into the sphere, Cavor insists they go and leave him there. He wants to study the Selenites, and he believes he can reason with them. To be honest, Bedford and Kate really don't argue. Once the Cavorite is fully activated on the sphere, it once again rises skyward. And Bedford, we are told, managed to manoeuvre them home, landing in the sea off of Zanzibar. The sphere, the only evidence of their journey, sank, and nobody ever believed their story. And that is the end of Bedford's reminiscing. But back on the moon in the 1960s, those astronauts have found the multicoloured entrance to the world of the Selenites. But the subterranean land within has changed greatly in the intervening years. Everything is crumbling, decaying, and there are no signs of life. It is suggested that it's as though some plague destroyed all the life that was there. Some of the men from the UN Space Agency speculate that it could just have been some simple germ brought to the moon from Earth, something that the creatures there had no immunity against. And in the last panel, we see Bedford contemplating the fact that Cavor did have a dreadful cough. Did he? He did as well. It was round about the halfway point in this comic that he started coughing. And he even said, popping in and out of that hot greenhouse gave me a cold. From that point on, again and again and again, we saw him cough when he was speaking. So Cavor, the man of science who wanted to learn so much about the lunar civilization, actually led to its downfall. Hold on though, didn't H.G. Wells already use that idea in War of the Worlds? That came out a few years before he wrote First Men in the Moon. Well, yes he did, but he didn't use it in First Men in the Moon. That was added to the film version. In the book, it is ended differently and more mysteriously in regards to the Selenites. Then we have a really odd one-page story, I suppose you can call it, where we see people in their car launched to the moon in a rocket, and there, once freed from the rocket, they drive around for a bit and wonder if the crust will hold a heavier vehicle. I don't get it. Is that supposed to be pure fantasy, theoretical science fiction, or maybe even satire? I don't know. What I do know is that this adaptation, much like the film, was all right. A lot less fast than in the film though, and definitely fewer geese. Another Harryhausen adaptation ticked off the list. Not the best known, but good fun all the same. Actually, Ray's next film was a bit of an oddity too. Don't get me wrong, it didn't have this one's light tone, and it is very well known. But it's probably best known for its poster more than anything else.